productized housing is like a really, really important solution to the greater housing problem in the United States, right? Like not everyone can afford a custom house, like a perfect, unique snowflake, but like productized housing, I think, delivers on a lot of the problems that we see in the market today.
What's up, guys? Welcome back to the Modern Craftsman. Today, we have founder and CEO of Den Outdoors from Hudson Valley, New York. He's a former tech operator, 15 years building software for startups before pivoting to home design. He raised $3 million in a seed round in 2023, and he sells modern cabin and home plans starting at just $999. Now layering in a Built by Den, which is a full construction management, along with prefab shell kits and AI collaborated build estimates. Author of How to Build a Cabin Built in Nature, Mike Romanowicz. So Mike is from Den. We're going to dig into his entry into this industry, which is different than a lot of people that we've had on this podcast. Most of us are started as craftsmen, craftspeople, builders, contractors. And Mike spent his time building software. And I had the chance to speak with him a couple weeks ago and really was intrigued by not only what he's already built, but what he continues to build and where he's focused his efforts, which is, prefabrication, productization, building really quality information, before you get into the construction aspect. So I think you guys will find this really interesting, and also give you some insight on how you can potentially improve your lead process at the end of this episode.
This podcast is brought to you by Andersen Windows. Nick, I think we mentioned this, but I finally got building permits for my house. I passed our erosion control inspection today, so that means I'm getting close to construction, which also means I'll be unloading my Andersen 400 series triple pane windows out of my shipping container and installing them hopefully in a framed house in short time. So I'm very excited about that. Excited to use their product, excited to document some of that build with Andersen, with Modern Craftsman, and share all of that with the entire community. But I may have to enlist some help getting those out of the shipping container because they were awfully heavy. I'm asking you, I'm asking whoever's listening to this. There were some of those units that I had trouble moving with one other person.
All right. I will take a day and come down to New Jersey.
We need the muscles. Yeah, so if you're listening, you want to just move some windows and doors, some super heavy triple glazed 8-foot tall doors, make your way down to New Jersey and I will put you to work.
All right. You know what I'll do is I'll bring a couple Harnish t-shirts because I know despite how great they are and how good they look, I'm going to probably sweat my ass off and need a new one for the ride home. You guys, it is 90-something degrees in Boston today, and I am, I'm always in my branded t-shirt, but I was walking down the street earlier, and I love the fact that they fit well, but they're also light. And I just got a brand new shipment because a bunch of my guys have sweatshirts and a bunch of their t-shirts are apparently all tattered up. And I didn't know this because they've been wearing a sweatshirt for the last few months. But I got a whole brand new run of Harnish t-shirts. The H Label, if you guys are looking for new t-shirts for your business, the H Label program is going to be your best bet.
I've always been the type of founder that wants to be like brand and product first and founder second. I want the thing to speak for itself, and I don't want to have to promote it or sell it beyond the merits of the thing. But now these days, people are like, I just want to connect with the personality first, and then hope that the product and the experience, are good, as a function of that.
I had that mentality when I first went into business, and it only got me so far, though. The merits of what you're doing being enough to sell the product, sell the service, and that was always the mentality for me, that was always going to be enough, and I don't think that it was. I think to get to the next level, to be able to sell more, to be able to sell different type of jobs, that you actually need to put something more out there. You need to back it. You need to back your product with the marketing.
I agree. I think I'm also speaking to my personal experience with Den. In the early days, it was truly the merits of the product that like helped us build community, helped us, build followership, build revenue, right? It was like a very, very product and brand centric experience. And we've only just like recently, within the past 12 months, begun to shift that narrative and the positioning within the business. But yeah, I mean, I think in the end, it's like, throughout the entire life cycle of Den, it's been like product brand, but like very, very quickly, like supported by me as either like a cameo actor or like the main actor in the experience.
At least for me, like some of the more viral content or the stuff that I watch is this like whole build in public series where it's like these companies are just building and like sharing how they're building their business. And I just came across one recently. They're called Bad Hombres, and it's a bean burrito company, and they just like started telling the story about like what they quit their job, that they did this, they did that, they lost all this money, then they made all this money, and I'm like, man, I'm kind of addicted to it. I want to see them win, and I think food is funny because I'm watching it happen in Boston a lot where there is these small companies that will launch like there's actually a bagel shop, Brick Street Bagels in Boston, and they launched and they just went super viral. And there's literally a line out the door every time they open. And and I was chatting with the owner a couple weeks ago, and he started selling pizzas, but you have to reserve the pizza a week in advance, and there's only like he only does like 30 of them a week or something like that. And funny enough, like my wife was like, we have to get on this list. And I'm like, are they good? She's like, I don't know. And like for 3 weeks straight, couldn't get on the list. And finally like popped in there one day and was like, I want one of your pizzas. And he was like, all right, I'll make sure you're on the list next week. And like, you came in, you expressed interest. And I went in there to pick it up, and I'm chatting with them, and I'm like, what's the deal? Like, why? Like, and he's like, I don't know, man. People just like bought into the story and bought into the fact that it's, there's only 30 of them. And I'm like, how long have you been making pizza? And he's like 5 weeks. Like I didn't,
Wow.
like I've never made pizza. He was like, I literally did this because I had all this extra dough from making bagels, and I didn't want it to go to waste. It's cool how, when you share that and you're telling the story and you're creating like this. I mean, you're just creating a storyline. People buy into it, and they're like, I'm here. Like, I'm buying the pizza because I believe in you. Like the pizza's good,
Yeah.
but it's not. Yeah. But it's not like it's not this like crazy pizza that you can't get anywhere else.
Yeah, I know. I mean, like, I think, like, to piggyback on that, I think now, especially, in an age of AI, also like in an age where people have a lot of media exposure and media training, right? Like, authenticity reigns supreme, right? And like, if you can be authentic and like do that, like with a heavy amount of transparency to the extent where you're like, hey, here are my wins, here are my failures, like here's like what the bottom line looks like of like my P&L. Like that is amazing. Like you've revealed everything, and you're like, you could take it or leave it, right? But like this is my like personal story, through all of this. And I think that's where marketing is headed, right? And why that stuff is so effective, right? Because you're like, this isn't created in like some bullshit like innovation lab, right? Or in like some PE think tank, right? And like, I'm not like a trustafarian that like, put this Ferrari in my driveway, like through artificial means, right? Or like through, revenue beyond like what I've actually created. And it raises the bar of like, what's real and like what people deem as success.
So in 2020, you launched a $21,000 A-frame cabin kit.
Yes.
And
oh man,
there was a video on YouTube called My Cabin is Broken, which was like some guy that built it, and it was just like a disaster. And you end up killing that part of the business. And I think ultimately it was, tied to like being hard to scale. It was confusing your investors. And you ultimately shifted the focus to plans. So like walk through that kit business. Like I know you sold I think you sold a fair amount of them, like 40 of them, if I'm correct.
Yep.
But what did you learn about that gap between like a great looking design and ultimately like what you thought might have been a buildable structure, but maybe wasn't?
Sure, sure. Well, first of all, I need to clarify, right? Like, that guy, right, bought a kit to effectively piggyback off of our branded product and like launch his own YouTube channel, right? So like I've seen that video specifically, and the title is so rage baity, like clickbaity. But the thing that's actually wrong with the cabin is the Pella window assembly, right? Like the gasket broke essentially, right? Like in the window assembly itself. And he went through this like big like warranty claim with Pella. Ultimately, Pella fixed it, right? But like it was a component of the kit, not the entire kit itself, right? The kit, as far as we know, for that customer and like every other customer, like was deployed, with great success, right?
That's a great example of like how content can shift a business, regardless if it's directly tied to you or not. Like it's still like brings it back to Den. And I mean, that's just the nature of it. Like, yes, YouTube is filled with clickbaity, rage bait, and get for the views. But ultimately, like it seemed to time, like it seemed to be in a similar timing as like killing the kit at and focusing on plans. So I'm curious, like, what did you learn in that first spurt of Den?
Yeah, for sure. And whether we're partnering with manufacturers or doing joint ventures, it's like the thing that I've learned is that if we acquire the customer, like we are the first and last neck to choke, right? So like even if the window gaskets break, like we are still on the hook to making sure that the thing is successful.
Right.
Welcome to our world.
Yes, exactly. But the early days of Den, like, going back to the beginning, right? Like Den really like originated, from a side project that scaled into a multi-million-dollar business, right? Like, I invested $10,000 of personal capital, deployed Den at a time like when the tailwinds for that type of business were like perfect. Interest rates were low, people were decamping from cities. My background is actually in technology and software. And, we very purposefully picked like a wedge in the market, that was like operationally, efficient, cost efficient, and would allow us to scale the brand like really, really quickly, through this, digital product, digital plans based business model, right? So like we originally started there, right? Like, and even to this day, like, a part of our P&L contains like digital plans and like platform based revenue, right? So it's been a meaningful experiment for the business over the years, right? And in the beginning, like like I've always been, for better or for worse, like an ambitious person that's like tried to like bite more and more of the pizza over time, right? So like when we saw that we could deliver construction documents that yielded good construction outcomes for customers, we were like, hey, like, why don't we try to create a physical product, that kind of piggybacks on top of like all of the learnings that we've had to date, right? Like, we've built buildings ourselves, like, maybe we can create a product here, right? And like, I've always been of the mindset that like productized housing is like a really, really important solution to the greater housing problem in the United States, right? Like not everyone deserves like a custom, or can afford a custom house, like a perfect, unique snowflake. But like productized housing, I think, delivers on a lot of the problems that we see in the market today, right? So like the A-frame cabin that we launched, in the early days of the company, it was like really the first experiment on like how to do that. And it came together in like such an like coincidental and awesome fashion because we ended up running the entire product line out of a Hudson Valley based fabrication shop, right? That their entire facility essentially like ground to a halt because of COVID. They were mostly doing like fabrication work for like events, right? Like, Frito, like, large scale corporations would hire them to do like set design and like different stage build outs and like, different environmental build outs. And like, because no one was doing in-person stuff at the time, they were like, holy shit, like we need to figure out how to make money. And I was like, guys, like we should just try to figure out how to prototype like a small A-frame cabin. And like the R&D costs on that building initially were just like so low that I was like, we have to do this, right? Like, we have to see what it's like, and we have to like, figure out, how to build this product. And the early insight for like a product level insight for that initial A-frame was the entire design was built off of the largest window assembly that we could get that was cost effective for us to also be able to distribute on a national basis, right? So we checked like everyone's manufacturing tolerances from like Andersen, Sierra, Marvin, Pella, like, no name brands. And ultimately we were like, oh, cool. We can get like a triangular 2-part window assembly from Pella at a reasonable cost to make this like a digestible go-to-market cost for the thing. But like the entire geometry of the building was based on Pella being like, yo, we can make it as big as this and no bigger, right? And like the window assembly was like a couple $1,000. So, we shipped like nearly 40 of them, like, across the country, lower 48 states, a cool story from like the early innings of that was like the chairman of Dwell Media actually emailed us and was like, hey, I saw that you offered this thing. Like, and I was like, yeah, I think his name was Dan, right? And I was like, I'm like, yeah, do you want some? He's like, yeah, I'll take 3. And he bought 3 just like that, right? And we shipped them to his property in Montana. And after we delivered them, he wrote me back and he's like, the craziest thing about this is that, you actually delivered them, right? And he's like, and it was also at a time when a lot of prefab companies would like spin up and it would like create this like great vaporware expression of like what it is that they offered with like, I guess, somewhat realistic, go-to-market pricing. And like, they would never fucking deliver, right? It would be like wait list, maybe like a small deposit, to try to capture like real customer intent and signal. But like, it would be dead on arrival. No one would ever ship. So this guy was like, it was so impressive that you offered it, you fabbed it, you got it to us, right? And it was as depicted. And I was like, yeah, dude, I was like, you don't know how stubborn I am. Like there was no other option for me, right? But the thing that we learned in that initial expression of like a prefabricated house is, I think like our pricing was like $20,000 per unit, like in, early, like mid 20s, I think was where we ended up. But like, it is so logistically and operationally intense to support like shipping a building of any size, right? Like whether it's like a shed, a sauna, like an A-frame kit to a place, right? And like in the end, it's like it was more of like a marketing. It created more marketing value for the company than it did like it affect our bottom line, right? Because like, our customers also like were like, hey, like their like understanding of what we were even going to give them was like so out of whack because like they were like, are you shipping me a sectional sofa? Like, are you going to bring it exactly to the place? Like, is it going to pop together? And we were like, no, we're like shipping you 3 tons of building materials, right? Like, and you're going to have to put this thing together, right? And like, we've made it really easy with like a CNC machine and like all of this like visual instruction. But like, this is not a like sectional sofa that you're gonna set up in your living room, right? This is like a real building with like real building principles, right? So in the end, like we determined like the juice wasn't worth the squeeze, right? Like because there's a lot of effort, a lot of operational complexity, like a lot of insurance risk, brand risk, even, to the point of this one YouTube video on like one $25,000 shipment to a place, that's like really, and like we, like in good conscience, like we did everything possible from a product perspective to make it as easy as possible for a layman to do it. Right. And like our team, like me, the person who designed the cabin and a carpenter put our building together in like 2.5 days. And I was, I did all the roof work. I was like, oh, cool. This is pretty easy. We can like confidently say that you can put it together like, in a week. And like customers would come back to us and be like, it took us 2 to 3 weeks. And I'm like, we're not calibrated on your ability. Like it took us 2.5 days, and we more than 2x that, in our promise, and we were like in as little as 7 days. But like, the F1 pit crew team that actually put it together did it in way less time. So like we weren't trying to bullshit people, But yeah, I think like Den started from like this very like grassroots, like tiny house, like trying to productize like small scale buildings place. And the intent then was to always make really great housing available to a broader segment of the market, right? Like through either like an easier way to access it, an easier way to deploy it, and I think what we found over time is that as interest rates climbed, right? Like, and as the kind of composition of the market changed, right? Like our pipeline now, like where we first started with like backyard tiny home builders, right? Like our pipeline now is like entirely comprised of like high net worth individuals, right? That like want really great looking modernist buildings, right? Without all of the bullshit of like dealing with like a design build company or like, no offense, Nick, right? And Tyler, I don't know what you do, but people are just like, I just want a straightforward solution and a beautiful building as an outcome with like some sense of cost certainty and timeline certainty, right? And like our entire catalog strategy has shifted from like buildings under, like 400 to 600 square feet to buildings that are now like anything from like 800 to like almost 4,000 square feet, right? Because like that's where the market activity currently lies, right? And like today, like we have the CTO of like a name brand tech company in our pipeline, who could like easily afford like any type of partner or any type of building, but he's just like, hey, I chose you guys because you offer the most straightforward experience and you have really, really great looking buildings. Right. And I was like, oh, cool. Like that's exactly what we stand for. So yeah, today it's like, we still continue to offer plans and, this, what we call plans and platform approach where people will kind of guide their own project, right? Like, they'll get our construction documents, they'll customize them through our platform, they'll seek out third-party engineering, they'll seek out like third-party, construction support, right? And that represents like some portion of our business. But a growing portion of our business right now is actually us working with customers and offering them prefab versions of our most popular designs, right? And in that case, like we actually bundle in like more of the third-party services. So like, we offer our customers fully engineered buildings, essentially shipped to site. We help vet their contractors. We train their contractors. We also offer assembly services, and we can erect the building on their behalf and let a local general contractor finish it out. And that's a growing segment of our business, and it makes sense for a lot of reasons. Like people just want more support, and like have to, deal with less headaches throughout the process. And then Nick, I was sharing this with you last time we met. We also just recently launched a sister company called Fasten, which essentially helps general contractors and developers, design build shops sell in a similar way that Den does, which is offering customers pre-designed plans, directly embedded on their website, offering them like real-time generative price estimates on that, right? That's, provided by the magic of AI. And really helps to like structure a general contractor's pipeline so that like for the first time, they understand like what their leads are worth, right? Whether or not a lead has land or doesn't have land, what they want to build. And it really like what we've found for Den, like since we've installed it as kind of like patient zero or customer zero, is that we just have to deal with like way less tire kickers, because like we just know that the people like actually want to build. So, our sales team works with the people, who are actually in market, not the ones who are just like, I'm generally interested. Let me take this 30 to 60-minute sales call with your company to like continue to fantasize about this thing that like I'm not even close to actually executing on, right? So we found that to be like really, really important to our business and important to the overall strategy of the company. Because, as it's like selling housing is like very lumpy in terms of
Yeah.
revenue, right? But for us, this is our first attempt to provide the greater industry all of the value that like we've learned through operating Den over the past 5 years, and it seems to be working really well for our GC partners.
I know that you said that there's obviously a housing issue, and cost of housing and all of that. Was that really the driver, the impetus behind the idea for Den, or did you see something more or opportunity that you're not necessarily alluding to? Like, what was the real driver for coming from a software technology background to now Den? Like, that's a massive leap.
I've always been like on the design side of software businesses, right? So like I've been a generalist designer, and a user experience designer for a better part of my career. And I think the thing that just like struck me about building a house, right, is that there's a lot of decisioning, there's a lot of complexity, as a layman, like if you're like a dentist or an attorney, it's like, why do you have to know what R value is, right? Like, why do you have to understand like what a California corner is, like in terms of a framing method, right? Like, why do you have to like double check your general contractor, right? Like on things that are so specific, to the industry, right? And like, why does it have to, building a house necessitate you to become an expert, right? So like that was the original impetus, right? Like, how do we make this like more easily understood? How do we create more predictable outcomes, right? And take away some of the opaqueness of this industry, right? Opaqueness of pricing, opaqueness of methodology, right? And like try to just put the customer really in the driver's seat, right? And also, in the early days, it's like to even get to buildings like that look like the ones that we sell, there's just this massive premium associated to them. Like if you were to engage like a traditional design firm or a design build firm, and we were like, that's not fair. It's like still just a gabled roof building. It just has like really cool modern aesthetics and like either a half round gutter or like a hidden gutter assembly. Like, why should I have to pay this like massive premium because I want to live in like more modern expression of a house? So for us, it was just trying to, create like broader access, right? And then, there will always be, for a number of reasons, like from zoning to, new construction financing to HOA friction, like a scarcity of housing in the United States. Like there's no way we're going to fix that on like a decade long time horizon, so I would say over time, like it was just easy to associate Den, and anyone building housing in the United States to this like massive disbalance of supply and demand in, the American housing economy, really, right? And like, I'm of the belief that almost all net new housing is good, right? Like we're undersupplied by a number that like should keep us all up at night.
I think the struggle that we have in the industry, is the expectation that we set forth for each build and how we're managing that from a client perspective. Like what would you anticipate the people who are investing in your designs, investing in your homes, like how are you managing those expectations for these clients to make sure that they're happy with the product, happy with the experience, especially when it's such a significant investment, and essentially like your online house shopping?
The first and like strongest thing that we try to coach our customers on, right, is cost. And like the entire premise of Fasten, this new company that we launched, right, is like trying to assign a very accurate forecasted cost to the build, right? Like an end-to-end cost, right? Which is, I think, unique to, well, it's certainly unique to us in terms of the offering, right? But unique in this space because, like custom home construction, like probably starts with an initial bid. And I know, Nick, that you do a ton of work on pre-construction, right? To try to like get that number really tight. But, a lot of general contractors, probably underbid because they don't spend enough time like doing diligence, and then also there's this notion of just change orders that, naturally happen within a project that result in, additional billings, right? And also add friction to the project, right? But like for us, what we found is the power of a pre-designed plan, really pushes the customer, and whether we ship them the building or whether they build it with the GC, but it like really puts confinements around the what, right? And like, it's like a 2-bedroom, 3-bedroom, 2-bath, gabled roof design. And like, that just creates a lot of certainty upstream, right? And for the most part, like, yeah, certainly there's like some customization that happens or like some FFE customization that happens like, through the life cycle of the project. But like in the end, and we've seen this like across like hundreds of builds at this point, like people end up with more or less the thing that they started with, right? And like that is the power of a pre-designed plan. And this is why, whether you're a GC or a developer or Den or a similar company, like when you start with something that's pre-designed, it just solves a lot of the downstream issues and expectations management to your exact question, right? Then starting from like either a napkin drawing or like a brief about like, an ideal cottage on a place, right? Like, and yeah, that's just an operating model that we've found to be quite successful that solves for a lot of that downstream anxiety. But it's not for everybody.
No, but it's also, I mean, the whole pre-design argument is really you're working from 100% and then you can iterate backwards. You said it earlier. It's like, this is really for that market. Like we build $3 to $15 million projects, right? Like they're custom, it's full architect led. It's just a different product, but
for sure.
But what you're doing is you're, as you said, like you are giving access to, higher quality homes and higher design homes by productizing it. And, and rather than starting at a blank piece of paper and zero and iterating and then going through what we would say is our pre-construction process and eventually getting to the cost, you've essentially established the cost. And now you're working backwards with where it's like, does this work or do you want to change things? And if you do, it's just a process. We did talk at length about this when we were on a call before, but since then I actually connected with a pretty high-end millwork company, and they're nationwide. They ship around the US, and I had asked about their pricing model, and I said it must be every project must be custom, and they said no, we actually decided that we're just going to create like a set number per component. So when we're sitting in a meeting, I can look at it and say, all right, there's 17 components times my multiplier. This is what your kitchen's going to cost. And we got to talking about that for a while. And the reality is like some designs they make more margin on and some they lose more margin on. But they're able to like the ability to just get right to the price and be able to close that project. Like, doesn't matter if they're making more margin or less margin. And I think, the argument to support what we're talking about is, a lot of builders, forget like whether or not they're actually making the margin, but spend so much time making sure that they're making the particular margin across everything. Where it's like you could be closing and doing more work if you were faster at it.
Yes.
Where it's like the fatiguing process of like pricing is exactly that. Like the client just is fatigued through the process. We lose big jobs. It's like months of like figuring out what this thing costs, and it just it kills you. And you mentioned AI, but that is exactly the use case here, where it's like, number one, you can componentize this, for particular projects. I would also argue, and this is a much longer conversation, that you could do this in the $3 to $15 million realm. It's more work and more training up front, because everything that you do when you're pricing a job, I don't care if it's $100 million house, everything is done by like looking at something and quantifying it in time, material, whatever it is. Like there is a calculation that you're doing. And recently someone was like, yeah, but it's like something I know in my head. I'm like, right, which you could tell, like, hey, this is what I'm thinking. I look at this and this is what I notice. So I add this multiplier and that's how I know how much it costs. But longer story. The productization is probably exactly that, where it's like you look at it, you basically create the baseline, and sometimes you win and sometimes you lose. But in the when you spread it across enough projects, like you're operating at a profitable like in a profitable way as a company.
The model to me is a very interesting model, and it seems as though you would make the most money when you do not get into customizations. Like, the less customizations they can make, the easier it is to make money. Like, why integrate customization of the plans in? Is it just a necessary evil that you have to because people don't exactly want what the first iteration is?
I think it's a number of factors, right? Like, I think that, housing as a product, like, I've spent the past 5 years trying to express a way of buying housing that's almost like buying a car as opposed to like actually buying a house, right? Where it's like, when you buy a car at a dealership, they offer a number of models, they offer a number of trim lines, they offer a number of colors and, different types of customizations, but it's all, within like a very strict playbook, right? And, and we've heavily invested in like this hypothesis that you can offer a house like a car. But after 5 years of trying, I've divorced myself of that possibility, right? Because I think that the thing with a house is that it's a very personal thing to a lot of people, right? It's like their day-to-day environment, right? It's also a incredibly high consideration and high cost thing that someone undertakes in their life. And if they're going to spend $500,000 or $1 million or, $3 million, like they want to really make sure that it reflects, their taste and what they want in their day-to-day experience. So like while we have like incredibly talented designers and architects working on our products, obsessing over, all of the details in a way that like a, layperson really can't see, honestly, right? Like we've gotten to the place where like, we're like, well, if you want the kitchen island to look like that, more power to you. Right. And I think for us, like just from like a business success perspective, right? Like, for us, the thing that's most important, right, is that a person gets to a building that they like and to a successful construction outcome, right? And like maybe we're less precious about it than a traditional design build company, because we're like, okay, cool, like this is what you want. That looks great, that like pencils, from an aesthetics perspective, just go for it, right? But yeah, for us, like, we have different product lines to support varying levels of customization. So like on our digital plan side, like you can go to town, right? Like you can totally refactor the building, to your heart's content. And we've done a lot of, very ambitious projects like through that particular product line. But on the prefab side, there are real constraints, right? Because like, there's pre-established engineering, pre-established fabrication, like for example, like on our gabled roof structures, like you can elongate the building along the ridge beam axis in 4-foot increments quite easily, but you can't widen the building, right? Counter to the ridge beam axis, because that essentially breaks like everything and results in a net new house with like net new engineering, etc. Right? So, and I would say like we have, customers that respect those confinements. They're just like, okay, great. Like I can make it longer, cool. Like I can't make it wider, cool. And like in the end, they're like, wait, you're gonna ship me this beautiful building, that has like 3 beds, 2 baths, and it'll go up in 5 to 15 days, like fully conditioned, and then we just have to worry about like, the fit out. Like that's amazing, And I would say like our customers are like people who are, like they're high net worth professionals that just like don't want to deal with the hassle of traditional building, and also maybe aren't in like a, economic bracket to afford, like the full kind of concierge support of like a premium luxury builder like Unique, right? And like, but they want a cool building, and they want it like somewhere between $800,000 and like $2 million. Like that's our sweet spot in terms of turnkey finish cost, right? In terms of hard cost, and we deliver a great building with great environmental and energy performance, with a, in a deployment model that's a little bit less anxiety filled, right? Than, a custom home builder that's just trying to, just do something from like, even like houseplans.com. Like if you were to buy something from them and try to run that through the process, it's like there's so much risk for going off the rails.
Where does this process break when you're thinking about like client comes to you, wants to build a house? Is it the site conditions? Is it like code feedback, or like in different parts of the country? Like where, I guess I think about, there's architects listening to this, there's builders listening to this, and you come from a tech background. Like that's clear in the way that you speak, the way that you guys have, iterated through the business. Like you guys move fast, you break things and you fix it and you keep moving. So I think a lot of people are like, this doesn't make sense. Like it won't work in my area, or, or the client's not like, just going back to my question, like where does this break?
One of DEN's main objectives is to just simply improve the construction literacy of the general person in the United States and Canada, right? And like where we've seen things break is really in the upstream portion of a project, where there is a complete mismatch between like expectations and reality, right? And that could be like a pricing mismatch. Like that could be like a zoning mismatch, where like people, like in the early days of Den, like, 5 years ago, people were like, yeah, I'm going to buy this like rural piece of property and put 30 cabins on it. And then they don't realize that they have to like re-entitle the property, deal with, the community, like, and then they're just like, then they find out like, that's just impossible. Like you can't even, and we've encountered that time and time again. And then we've also encountered people who think that they can build 1,000 square foot building in a premium market for like $100,000. And you're like, that's impossible. Like, you're like, you have no idea of the sense of gravity in the world that you're working in. Right. And like, we do a lot of work either through like content, coaching, the tooling and technology that we build, right? Like even the plans themselves are like a low cost way of trying to do due diligence, right? Before you like pull the trigger on like $1 million check, right? And I think that's, like that's where we've seen it. That's where we've seen it break a lot. And that's where we've spent a lot of time investing in solutions around, right? Because like once the project is underway, like so much has already been established that like, yeah, if there's like a surprise from like the Department of, Environmental Protection, whatever it ends up being, like that is like truly a downstream surprise, right? Like we're trying to align people to like, budgets that don't have too much variance, right? Like, timelines that don't have too much variance, but I would say where it breaks for a business, right, is that, customization is the enemy of scale, truly, right? Mm-hmm. Like when we were, when we've, have experimented with like different operating models, like, we ended up in one where we were like, essentially like a design build sweatshop. And we were like, this is like totally untenable for our business. And like, we had to shut it down, and like, we had to move on to things that were operationally more straightforward and, just like offered just a more, yeah, overall, just a more straightforward, approach to offering housing, in this market with like less risk envelope, right? But like the secret sauce of like Den's prefab business, right, is, we take a bunch of disparate, supply vendors and we obsess about how to bring those products together in a way that creates like one cohesive, coherent system, right? We engineer it exactly to the site conditions that it's deployed on, and we offer a service layer with, that's guided by like highly experienced individuals that help people through, like the challenges of building a house, right? And like it's not rocket science, right? Like, but like some of our customers are like, oh yeah, I'll just take the plans to like a SIP panel company and like do it myself. I'm like, good luck. I'm like, if you like just bring the plans to a SIP panel company, like that's like only a fraction of the problem. Right. Like our team is obsessing about like collisions between like outlets, MEP, like different, framing members. Like we're obsessing about like the health of the air quality, like the performance of the build, like, and like I've seen our team argue over like millimeters about like the reveal between like drywall and like like the framing element of a window. Like we care about a lot about it, right? But like some of these things are like invisible to the customer in the end, right? But I'm like, it's not that, it's hard, but it's also not that hard. But like, sometimes when people are like, yeah, I'll just do it myself. I'm like, good luck. I'm like, we offer you like a great set of tools to try to do that. But like, we also provide this like incredible amount of value on the prefab side. But for people who are looking to recreate Den's business, that's really the magic formula, right? It's like, just bring together a bunch of different things, right? Cook it up into something new and just be a fucking expert and make sure that people like have an easy time of it.
Is this way more than you thought it would be when you had this idea 5-6 years ago?
That's a great question. It's now with
if you would have told me this was your idea, I would have been like, run away.
Yeah.
As soon as you start customizing shit, it's like, all right, I want to sell house plans. I want a commodity based product, but it's like, it seems like the more that you have to do, you're just getting to the point where like you're almost just a builder, and it's like now you're dealing with all of the headaches of that.
Yeah, I would say like, we recently rewrote the How It Works page on Den's site, and as I wrote that, I was like, wow, the expression of Den as a business is like finally at the place that I always thought it would be, right? But, in year 0, year 1, like I never thought that we would be offering prefab at the scale that we were offering it, right? Like I never thought that we would have like an integrated digital platform that like manages projects and like customization, all of that stuff. Like, I never thought that we would, like Fasten is like a kind of late stage insight, to try to just like roll up and offer, builders and developers, a solution that we've seen work for ourselves. Like it comes from like a very credible experience driven place. Right. And like that only emerged in the last year. Right. So like, no, I didn't think that we would end up exactly here in terms of the business composition. Right. But right now it feels as though like the Den business is complete, right? Like we have like no other tricks up our sleeve, right? Like there's no, like we're not going to invent a house that comes in a pill, that you can throw on a site and water with a can, like there's no, I think that we've like achieved the right operating model, right? And I think that there's also a truism within this industry, which is the closer you get to the actual construction, the more money that there is, right? And like we've seen our digital plans business essentially like stay flat like year over year. It's like, we run it because it gives people access to the designs and it delivers on the original thesis of the business. But like, there's no large scale business when you're just selling plans and a process. Like you have to you have to eventually get to the hard work, which is giving people real construction outcomes and owning that process. But I think that offering it through a prefab methodology helps us kind of bridge the gap between like pure play builder, pure play design build firm, and like a product company.
I think it was inevitable that Den arrived in this place, like going through all of this, that this is at some in some way, shape, or form, that like this was bound to happen.
Honestly, I mean, like, yes and no. I stubbornly fought this for a long time because I was like, I just want to be an asset light, IP led, process led, technology led business, right? And we threw everything in the kitchen sink at like trying to scale like our digital plans business, and it just doesn't work, right? Like, there not many people want to start the process of building a house using like an off the shelf set of plans with no baked in support, right? And like it was tough because I was like, we've like failed to scale this one thing, right? And then what I learned even as an entrepreneur through this process is that sure, you can like make meaningful tweaks to a business or business model, and like that results in incremental growth. But like the real way to create punctuated growth for a business is just to think about like the big swings, right? And like, you can't like digital plans plus a service layer like only provides incremental benefit. But like as soon as we shifted to like, hey, we're offering homes as a whole, like that just totally transformed the business. And then, when we offered like a totally, new like technology component, which is Fasten, that's like already like creating a halo effect for the overall business. But like, we were like noodling on digital plans for years. We've tried everything, and like there is just
you should have just asked me. I would have been like, nah.
I know.
As soon as you start customizing, it's like, damn, there goes all of our margins. Like now we're just in this. Now we're like, now I got to go back and change this and move the toilet here, and now they don't want that. Now they want another meeting, and it's like, oh, I can't get away from it now.
No. We have a really great platform that enables customizations, right? But like I think that there's just, like what we found now is that, customers who want to build $1 million home, like they want the service, right? It's like for the same reason that AI will never replace real estate agents. Like when you buy $1 million asset, you want someone to open the door for you and be like, hey, look, here's the oak flooring and the blah, blah, blah. And then it suddenly like legitimizes the entire process and purchase.
Tyler and I were at the Builder Show in Vegas, and the hotel we were staying at had this restaurant, like a pizza restaurant. And literally next to the restaurant was a vending machine that you could put $20 in, and it would make you a pizza.
Yeah.
And it's like the same thing. It's like I can basically get the same thing, immediately out of a machine, or I can sit down and have a waiter and go through the experience. Like there will always be the desire for the human experience. I will push like on the customization. I think like from a design perspective, like it's so much easier. Where like there's a software company right now that I've seen at the show a couple times. You literally can go on your computer, like pre-populate a house and grab it and pull it and click add porch, delete porch, add wind, and it was just like it's immediate, and it would give you it would go as far to like do all the engineering live. So the moment you were like, this is my house, it would give you a complete construction document, packet. The problem is like that's fine, but now like building it, like you can't, to your point, like there's where the customization breaks the scale, because now it's like you don't have a factory just like ready and that's making any size wall and rafter at your beck and call. The ability to scale, on the actual construction side is by building the same thing over and over, or a limited amount of quote unquote SKUs.
Yeah. I would also add, and like you guys are probably old enough to like have watched The Simpsons and, seen a lot of the episodes, but there's this like one episode where Homer Simpson is like invited to design a car. Like his like relative owns a car company, and he ends up designing this thing called the Homer car, right? Which is this like ridiculous car that has like every feature that Homer has like ever wanted, right? And like, it's like a glass bubble, horn, like everything. And it ends up bankrupting the car company because it's like too, like he's like went way over in terms of R&D costs. It's like almost unbuildable, right? And exactly. And this is like, to me, the most like effective metaphor, right? Because like if you give someone who has never looked at a floor plan or has never really studied architecture, right? Like, a parametric model for building a house, and they can add porches and bathrooms and, bedrooms at will. It's like, is that still a good building? Right? Like,
Right.
like, and I think that the reason why like the human element is so important is like, yeah, there's guidance required, right? Like a home is an experiential product, and it's like a day-to-day experience. And like, you need someone to help you through those decisions. Right. And like, and that's why I think it's like, it's, yeah, as much as I want things to change rapidly in this industry, right? And as much as I try to apply technology to solve these problems, it's like, I just can't, like, how do you tell AI like what it feels like to stand inside of a really
Yeah.
well executed space?
So what does your prefab model look like? Do you have partners with different factories or fabricators throughout the country, or is it just one? Like, what's that look like?
Exactly. Yeah. Like we have a different set of vendors, across like three main elements of the building, right? Which is panels, structural steel framing, and then window and door schedule. And then those are kind of like plug and play. And then what we do is we own the digital modeling that like aligns, all of those vendors in like a very, essentially like a 0 millimeter tolerance perspective, right? And our modeling is like so high fidelity that like we know where every outlet goes, where all the MEP goes, like the light switches, like just everything, right? And that just allows us to, yeah, deliver on a building in a really high confidence way, where we're just like, cool, this is what to expect. This is where everything goes. Like for us, it's not important, like what cabinetry you choose. Like, we design our kitchen schedules to make use of, normal size cabinets, like either 24 inches, 30, 36, right? And it's like whether you buy them from a, local millwork company, IKEA, company like Reform, or something more high end, it's like it'll all fit because we know it fits.
What you just said is like the premise behind all of this, where people build and renovate homes and they're not thinking about the cabinetry. Like they're basically framing the wall, the room out, and then they're measuring it and then trying to fit stock cabinetry in it. And I had this, we had this project years ago where they didn't have the budget for custom cabinetry. Like they were like, Nick, we, as much as we'd love you to build everything, like we just don't have the budget for it. I said, that's fine. We can work with, stock cabinetry. And they're like, well, I've seen it. It just looks like shit. It's like, yeah, but if we think about it before we go into this, you're not going to end up with 4-inch fillers. Like we'll work within the parameters of stock cabinetry, and we'll just think about it before we actually install it. And we installed it, and it looks like a custom kitchen because all we did was think about it. Like we just were like, hey, let's build the space to make sure it fits appropriately.
I mean, dude, it's like so many of our product or like design level decisions are driven from third party manufacturing restrictions, right? So
Yeah.
like a lot of like Den's smaller cabin designs are driven by the fact that it's really easy to get a 16-foot sliding glass door, right? Either like, 4 panel, various like opening configurations. But like as soon as you get over 16 feet, it's like, poof, it like results in, additional mulling, like additional cost, like whatever, maybe some custom products, but like it's really easy upstream where you're like, hey, I want to make a cool cabin, that has like this target square footage, to be like, oh fuck, we can only get a 16-foot wide door. Like let's make the entire building footprint, 16 plus the sidewall depth, right? And then you're like, okay, great. Like that's
Right.
settled, and then you just put it in the window and door schedule, and you're like, hey, Marvin offers several 16-foot wide sliders. Just go buy one of those.
I
You
think
know?
Andersen, that's the sponsor for the podcast. So
Okay,
that's who
okay,
we're
okay,
offering.
and Andersen, right?
And Anderson. You know what? Like we talked about Seaside years ago on this podcast, the community down in Florida, and we went down this rabbit hole of just like how when they go in there and they're building hundreds and hundreds of homes, these guys just understand down to the nail like what these homes cost. And I think about a comment my teacher made in college for construction management, but I remember him challenge, and at the time, like I was like, "You're insane! Like that makes zero sense." But he challenged us. He was like, "If when you're thinking about building a home and you're trying to be cost efficient, think about." He gave this example. He goes, maybe 7-foot increments of dimensional lumber is the most cost effective way to buy it. And he's like, in 14, for example, 14 footers are the most cost effective when you break down the unit cost of that. 16s are more expensive, 12, et cetera, et cetera. And he basically said, like, when you're, if you're going to build like towards a budget, look at the layers of that and understand like what is driving the efficiency. So like for your example, Mike, you're talking about the design, right? Like you want this full glass wall and you can't get full glass because it's only up to 16. It's like modify the design. Now you have full glass. It's like, and it's the same thing from a cost perspective. It's like, hey, our costs are coming in. It's like, well, are you just buying enough material to get the design done? Or are you designing within the materials constraints?
Right, right. I mean, I think for me, like, to bring this back full circle, those muscles were the ones that I was developing in software and tech, right? Because like in that world, it's like you create components that are always reusable across the entire architecture of an application, right? And they call it like atomic design principles, right? Where everything is kind of atomized and reusable. And for me, I've like brought that thinking into, creating housing as a product where, you make these decisions based on reusable components, right? And that could be like either the fact that, it's like a 4x8 sheet good. Like we're working on a project right now for a hospitality client, and, we built this entire prefab concept, like based on the reality of a 4x8 sheet good as a finishing material, right? And we're like, hey, you can like finish the interior walls of this building so easily because it's based on this one principle, right? And that comes up time and time again in like all of our designs, right? Like we're not trying, like our brief isn't, it's not from this like creative place, like inherently creative place. It's like, we're creating a product, like we take a very product oriented approach. So whether it's a 4x8 sheet of, plywood or a 16-foot like sliding door assembly, or this like, the largest triangular assembly we can get from Pella for like an A-frame kit, there's like something that we use as a governing force for like the entire building, while also trying to deliver a housing product that like is aesthetic, is functional, is performant, right? Like people want to spend time in, right? Like, and that's pretty much it, man. And I think that the trick that and the thing that we're also even trying to coach like GC partners on is the componentization of building. And like even Fasten as a technology essentially takes a set of construction drawings and strips it down to all of the components of that building and then builds the price up from there, right? And like that's hard to do, like through just like a manual exercise, but is much easier to do from a technology perspective. But the componentization of a building is like something that modular companies are doing, I guess, and like large scale production builders, but like doesn't come readily to like, mom and pop and SMB style builders, I think.
Well, that's the exact issue, is that there's not enough scale in our industry for most people, right? It's like, all right, you're a home builder. How many homes are you building throughout the entirety of your career, right? It most of the time what you're doing is one off, whether it's custom or not custom, but you're learning these things as you go. It's not like, hey, I was able to design 1,000 homes. They were all similar. We built them around this one system. And then you understand like the benefits of the scalability and creating interchangeable designs within a certain subset, or a certain structure. But I think that most of us as small contractors, as small builders, we're building a couple dozen homes in a career. And you don't get to realize the opportunity and the efficiency and how much savings you can have by actually doing what you're doing at scale. I think, like you said, the big production builders, they understand that. They understand the impact of like one less sheet of drywall or one less taped seam, whatever it may be. But I think that most of us don't understand that because we're just not working at that sort of scale whatsoever.
So I think for me, like my dream, right, is to imbue smaller general contracting outfits with the tools and the framework by which to do that, right? And I think like for Fasten, it's like we recognize that like, GCs that do custom construction, like we're not saying like, hey, like don't chase the whales, right? Don't chase like the big custom projects, that like have ornate custom details. But like if you want a more predictable revenue line on your P&L, that's like, sub-million, like just over $1 million with like these very prescriptive build outs where the costs and like the timelines and like the trade commitments are really well known. Like you could have this like very predictable revenue line humming through your business in addition to like all of this other really cool custom work you're doing, right? And I think that that's like the kind of model we're driving towards, and we're trying to find partners who believe in that framework of delivering housing.
If they sign up for the certified build partner, right? Like what's the realistic deal flow that they should expect, and even like what's the margin profile? I think that's what people are going to be interested in hearing.
Well, so I think for us, it's like it's less about being a certified partner to Den, right? And more about using Fasten as a technology, right? And Fasten effectively turns a builder's website into a direct booking engine, right? So like if you've historically relied on lead gen services, potentially local market, whatever that is, right? Like eventually someone needs to like end up at a place where you qualify them, right? And in this category, what we've observed is that, lead gen services give you like, really, to the extent that, compared to like what Fasten delivers, like unqualified leads, right? Like they don't know like whether or not they have land, whether or not, what they want to build, like what their budget is, right? And like today, like we've also observed in market, like if you're a general contractor, or like even a small regional builder, production builder, like you probably have a contact form on your website that like doesn't capture any meaningful details about like what the customer actually wants to do. And sometimes, which boggles my mind, it asks the customer to define their own budget for the project, right? Which is like asking like, it's like telling a dentist like how you want your dental work done, right? As like the person sitting in the chair, and you're like, holy shit, like I can't believe that people are using this as like real like pipeline signal or business signal, right? So I think for us, like Fasten
immediately goes to check my website to see if mine still asks.
Yeah, exactly. So I think for us, like Fasten as a technology, enables a builder of any scale, right? Like if you're doing like more than 10 visits to a site a week, right? It essentially takes, and like whether you're bringing that traffic from like, signage at a project, talking to someone at the grocery store line, paid advertising, whatever it ends up being, right? Like, you guys have like a podcast, you guys have Instagram presence, YouTube presence. Like some people have like really sophisticated digital ecosystems that drive a lot of traffic to a place, right? the question now is like, how do you qualify that traffic, right? And if you're doing it by just a list of services or like a list of past projects and a really dumb contact form that in some cases asks the customer to self-define their own budget, like I think that is a really dumb way to run your business, right? And like we've just given people a much smarter and efficient way to do that. And our whole system is predicated on this idea that like, hey, if you just show people some designs that you support and that you're willing to build for them, right? Like that is a way better starting place than just like, a basic contact form. And then Fasten as a technology then takes, that the signal that a person visiting your site gives you and then tells you as the builder, does this person have land? Yes or no, right? Like what are the conditions of that land? Are they in my serviceable area as a business or are they 3 hours away, right? Mm-hmm. What do they want to build exactly, right? Like, is it 3 bedrooms, 2 bedrooms, 4 bedrooms, 5 bedrooms? What is the geometry of that building? Is the roof line complex or not, right? Does it have a lot of glass or not? And then ultimately, what is the assigned construction value of that lead, right? So like on any given day, you could wake up in the morning and see like, hey, I've got 3 new leads from like the previous day. One of them is worth 937. One of them is worth 1.3. One of them is worth, 722, right? And then you as the builder are finally in the driver's seat and you could be like, I'm going to go for the biggest one first. I'm going to call them, and our technology also like nurtures to like first meeting. It includes like a lot of like, just like programmatic sales and marketing support, right? So that like, not only do you get the lead, but like it organizes to first meeting. And then Nick, you'll love this, right? Like our technology really tries to establish a pre-construction relationship between the prospect and the builder, right? So what we do is we put a highly accurate AI generated forecast on a project, which gets people most of the way there, right? Because then you could be like, oh, fuck, I'm not capitalized to do this. Like I should probably wait, but like leading with price is like a really, really powerful sales tool because the lead is now educated and you as the builder, you actually know whether or not this lead is worth your time, right? And then the whole system works to try to engage a diligence contract or pre-construction contract to then convert that AI generated price into a real contractually binding local price, right? And all of that happens upstream of the actual construction effort, right? And like that's where we found the most leverage, right? Because like if you can really manage expectations in the beginning innings of the game, right? Then like you really help to set up a successful downstream game, right? But like, and we've seen this ourselves. Like Fasten, I think maybe the easiest insight is like people used to write into Den, even though we have a catalog, right? That's like really obvious to navigate to. People used to write in and they would be like, can I get a price on a 2-bedroom, 1,000 square foot building? And I'm like, what? Like, yeah, what size? Like, what 2-story, 1-story? I'm like, give me more, but they would write in a one-liner with like insane urgency. They would be like, let's meet about this tomorrow. I will give you no fucking intelligence about what I actually want to do, right?
Would you respond?
We'd set up with like a new business. We would always like in the early days, we would be like, we'll meet with anyone to learn, right? Yeah. And because we were hungry, we were like, let's do this. But now Den like generates almost 100,000 visits to a site a month, right? And like we're a small team, and like we don't want to we want to give people the right amount of value and education, based on where they are in the life cycle of their project. So if you're like pre-land, pre-budget, pre-design, it's like we have a path for you, right? But if you have land, you want to develop it, you know what you want to do, it's like, boom, let's like jump into a call, figure out how to align you to the right product line and like help you do this, But like part of this category is that there's just a lot of dreamers. There's a lot of people that are just like, I'm not ready yet, but I want to talk to somebody.
It's an interesting business model. And I think one of the things I really took away from our first call is just like your introduction to what we're doing what we, like us builders, are doing from a completely different avenue, like looking at it from a tech perspective. And one of the things I really appreciate about just technology and tech companies is how they like literally will just put product out, take feedback, and then pull it back, and then reiterate, and then do it again. And I think that so much of what we do is just, we build ourselves up, and we try to approach with this like perfect process, and it breaks constantly. And we never, like, many of us get in this position of like never actually having a system in place. um and that it, like that is what, you know in some ways that's what pre-construction is designed to do, is it's really to help someone along the process and set the, like, de-risk the construction, and be in a spot where we're operating under like an actual system of building. But you are going all the way back to, the league qualification, which is, I've talked about it before, but the if you are in that like tech space and understand that side of it, and like you really dug into it, but the ability to qualify someone before you like actually interact is massive. And I made a comment a couple episodes ago where it's like, we don't get that many leads, so it's not that big of a deal. But I later thought about what what I said, because sure, like answering a handful of emails every once in a while to disqualify them is fine. It's not taking much of my time, but there's the emotional aspect of getting a new lead inquiry in your inbox, going from like, I got a new job. And then you look at it and it's like, maybe they're qualified. And it's just, the ability to like get rid of the noise and only focus on high quality leads and people that are pre-qualified. If anyone is taking anything from this episode, I think that is something that anyone can do. And if you just spend the time and really think about who is showing up to your place of business, whether that's a website or anything, and what does that first interaction look like?
I mean, I also think, Nick, it's just a testament to how lacking we are as far as systems go in our industry. And it's a huge, massive undertaking and massive task to try and systemize the industry, systemize what you're doing, building homes, designing homes. So I definitely applaud you for that, Mike. That is something that I think our industry lacks more so than many other things. And you're standing right up to it and doing your best to hold your ground there.
I really like Mike. I connected with him on LinkedIn. We hopped on a call a couple weeks ago, and I mean, the call was as energetic as he is today. And I was like, dude, we got to stop talking and we need to get in the podcast. I think the idea of productization is just super interesting. Obviously, I think he got to it, but like Fasten is something that you essentially as a builder could plug into and more or less, be, I don't want to say a dealer because that's probably the wrong word, but essentially create your own brand of productized buildings that you could then deploy in your market. So I think it's worth investigating. I also am super interested in seeing we've been going back and forth in the background, but in seeing what he's doing from the data scrubbing, like as he's pricing these projects, he's building that back end. Like the more homes he builds, the more data he gets, the smarter the model gets, and the ability to essentially just have more and more information. I chatted about another company that did this years ago, where it's like they had so much inbound work and they were pricing so much work that they just kept building this master spreadsheet that you could be on their website and tell them, I want to do this bathroom renovation. And it was like, I think it was like 21 questions. And they would say, this is how much your bathroom is going to cost to renovate. And if you want to move forward, click to schedule the next step. And it's like, again, there's going to be times where you make a ton of margin. There's going to be times where you lose a little bit of margin, but it all like works. It all kind of flushes out in the end, and you're converting more work because people are getting right to the brass tacks of what's this going to cost me.
I think that's indicative of a lot of things that we do in our industry and in our market as well. And speaking with many people in our industry, I think that most certainly is and can be the case. And I mean, it's no different than even just managing a construction budget and understanding what that budget needs to look like. And it's give or take, and it's not going to be exactly the way that you anticipated it. But as long as at the end of the day, the big number is where the big number should be, I think it all works out.
Well, guys, if you want to dig into this more, make sure you head over to moderncraftsman.co, sign up for our newsletter. It's where we give you the show notes, and then we will always share our additional thoughts above and beyond this. And it's also going to give you exclusive access to join us in our monthly workshops, where we take a lot of what we're talking about and share it in a way that you guys can implement into your business. So until next week, we'll see you then.
Adios.